told the story?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Right after I joined the church in April, my dad sent me to California to help Jean in Glen Ellen. It's a little, beautiful little town in the foothills near Nampa. And she was working, and her husband, Red, was over in Korea.
Explain
in
who
the
Jean
Army.
is a little bit.
Pardon?
Explain who Jean is a little bit.
Jean is my dad and his first wife's third child.
Right. So your
And
stepsister.
She's a half-sister to me, yeah. So I guess he called her on the phone and told her that I joined the Mormon church, and he was afraid I was, that Jay and I were getting too close and that we might get involved, and he didn't feel like I knew how to take care of myself. And so he wanted her to tell me what to do. So I get there to babysit for her and take the kids to their swimming lessons and all the things like that. And then she starts asking me if I'm sexually active, and I said, no, why would I do that? And she says, well, your dad thinks that you might be tempted. And so, do you know how to have prevent that from happening? And I says, I guess I don't, but I'm not worried about it because I'm not going to do anything like that. But she proceeded to tell me a little bit, but I don't even remember what she told me actually. So after school started in August for us in Idaho, so I got to leave early and come back home. But while I was there, right across the street was Nora, her mother. And I didn't know she was there. My mother didn't know she was there. I don't know if my dad did or not, but. And so she came over and visited a couple of times, but not very much. She seemed kind of shy. She wasn't outgoing at all, to me anyway. But she had, I don't know her situation completely, but she ended up having a husband who provided for her fairly well because she had a lot of nice things in her home. So that's all I knew. And but she just, when I started, probably 3 years later, she died. Nora died after the only reason I can remember that is it was my junior year in high school that I joined the church and went down to California. Then my first year out of school, I was at Twin Falls Business College. And then the next year I got a job at Hanford Reactors where my brother worked. And she died right after I started working there, so it was probably in June or May, maybe July, sometime one of those months. And she passed away. And so Gilbert left for the funeral, and somebody from he was a chemical engineer, and somebody in his office wanted to know specifics about her, and I says, I don't know very much about her. I don't know how old she was or anything, because she wasn't my mother. And they said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. But anyway, she was a beautiful woman, but I think she probably was depressed, and the situation she was in was probably depressing as well. So, you know, I'm not going to judge. I just know that what my dad told me, and he said she was not a good homemaker at all. So
And your mom,
my mother was Betty Crocker.
right?
Martha Stewart, however you want it. She could decorate, sew, cook, bake, whatever. She could do it all. Gardening. She did it all.
And
She didn't drive a car, but she was...
That's right. She didn't swim or drive a car.
That's right. She was afraid of water.
Why didn't she learn to drive? I don't remember why. I remember I asked her.
Well,
once.
she was driving Earl's car, I think. He says, oh, you can take my car, and she went into the ditch with it. She didn't wreck it, but
Yeah, it scared her.
it scared her, and a couple of times she told me she would drive one of the automatic cars down to a field and pick up Charles or my dad after I'd left home. But I never saw her drive.
So your mom has an amazing birth.
Yes.
You might want to just tell it, even though it's probably in your book, huh?
Yeah, it is, but my grandmother had several children, but only 4 lived. I think she lost 3. For some reason, she had to go to bed. Her body wasn't able to
Carrie full term.
carry a baby full time. And so my mother came early, and the neighbor came over to help my mother while my grandfather, her dad, hooked up a horse and buggy in South Dakota, Bruce, South Dakota, and went riding to find the doctor. And on his way there, the wolves started howling and spooked the horse, and he kind of did a runaway thing, and my dad, Grandpa, time he got it, the horse slowed down and under control, took longer than it should have, and then he picked up the doctor, and they went back to Bruce, South Dakota, and my mother was already born, and she was tiny. They put her in a little shoebox, and the shoebox had cotton, like cotton balls, only it wasn't balls, it was just cotton, and they rubbed her with oil and put her in the shoebox, and her sister, Ethel, was about 2 years older. She called her little kitty, because when she cried, she sounded like a little kitten crying. Yeah. But the doctor said, I only know one person that can save your baby, and she's an Indian squaw. And if you want to use her, pay her money, and she'd probably come here and do that for you. And so the doctor arranged it, is what it sounds like to me, and she showed up, and she didn't speak English. But she'd point at the sticks, meaning she wants some more to put in the wood stove, because she would put the baby in the stove, in the oven, to keep it warm. And then she took an eyedropper from the milk my mother's mother would take from her, and they
She would express milk and then
express milk, and she used a dropper to feed her. And she sat in a rocker, and she had a corn cob pipe that she smoked. And she put her feet in the oven, and she wanted a big pot of soup, and so she could dip from it whenever she was hungry to eat. And that's what happened. And after 2 weeks, the doctor said if she can keep her alive for 2 weeks, she'll probably make it. So she did it for 2 weeks, and then she left.
and she lived to be 97.
Yeah.
So she made it for sure.
That she, my grandma, her mother had brothers, and they'd come over to visit, and one of them picked up a teacup and said, I bet this would fit her head, and he put it on her head,
And it got stuck.
and it got stuck. And my mother said, they tell me I started screaming as a baby, and I just was crying and crying because they were trying to take it off and twist it and whatever, and nothing would happen. So her dad came home and yelled at him and said, you're never going to be in this house again. And I guess they put bacon grease or some kind of grease around the cup and finally got it off, but
That's how little her head was.
her
Wow.
head was little. They figure she must have been about a pound. She fit in a person's hand.
That is amazing.
Not very big at all. Tiny.
That's a miracle.
Yeah, she was meant to live. And I'd look at her little hands. Her little hands would come this far, would
Yeah.
be below the notches
Yeah.
on my hand.
Yeah.
It was
She
just
had
a small
little-
little hand, but it could make bread and cinnamon rolls and sew up a.
Beautiful
So-
dress. Yeah.
She could do hair. She was amazing. What she could do with those little hands.
What did was she just interested in all those things, or was that the culture?
I think it was the culture, and her mother, my grandmother, was trained to be a tailor
Oh, yeah.
because her mother died when she was about 14, and she left 5 or 6 kids behind, and she knew she was dying. The doctors examined her, and they found a big tumor on her ovary, and they couldn't operate, and so it would get so big, and then it was rupture, and she bleed to death.
Oh,
But she knew she was going to die, and so she taught Addie, my grandma, and so my grandma sold bread before the grocery stores had
sold it. They
She
talked
would-
about sliced bread, right?
sliced bread.
It's a great
she
invention.
would make bread, and people would buy her bread. She was known for having the cleanest laundry on the line. You had to hang up your laundry on the line. Everybody said hers was the cleanest. And her house was spit spot. She was immaculate. And,
I think her ghost is haunting me.
pardon?
I think her ghost is haunting me. As I see how messy my house is.
No.
Anyway,
My mother was a happy medium. She would, when she was sewing or when she was doing a lot of baking or anything like that, she let things go.
right.
But then once a week, we had to have a spotless house. And it was usually Saturday morning, and we had to get up and vacuum and dust and
Right.
all that.
That's kind of how I am. It's gotten worse, though.
But anyway, my mother had a great sense of humor, and my grandma and my grandpa Bickford were characters. They loved April Fools.
Really?
And they played tricks on each other every April Fools.
That's hilarious.
like she made biscuits really good. Well, she put a cotton ball in them. And he'd bite down on the biscuit and this cotton ball. Or he'd take her laundry that she had hung out on the line and he'd hang it in the barns. Should make her drive her crazy because she liked her laundry perfect. She was a good seamstress and she became a tailor. And so her dad, I don't think he remarried, but then whoever the next kid was kind of had to take over because the Bickfords hired her to sew suits for them and shirts.
Right.
And that's how she met her husband.
Right. I remember that story.
So,
So did she teach Grandma how to sew then?
yeah. But my mother, she taught Ethel. Ethel was the oldest, so she taught Ethel, and Ethel didn't like to sew. She didn't like to sew at all. Ethel was spit spot clean, everything. She's wiping things down. I don't know if you remember that when we go over there. She'd have a paper towel in her hand. She'd be wiping off stuff all the time.
I don't remember. I just remember she was a character.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole families are characters. They just had a cute
Funny
sense
way
of
about
humor,
them, yeah.
and very happy and congenial. And so my mother grew up with that sense of humor, and so that's where I learned to laugh a lot. Because they would be telling each other stories. We'd go to Aunt Marie's or Aunt Ethel's, or they'd come to our house, and they'd get to talking, and they'd be telling each other a story, and they'd all be laughing before the story was over. And it wasn't even a funny story. But they'd get it would
The
make
giggles.
It a story. They'd get the giggles. Oh my gosh.
That's so fun.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So Grandma learned, and her mom just taught her all the different homemaking skills.
Yeah.
But probably decorating, was that more her interest, or her mom taught her that too?
Well, her mom had a nice home. She had things organized and everything, but my mother had a knack that the others didn't have.
Right.
They did the traditional thing. My cousin Barbara is like my mother. She just knows how to decorate. And you go in her home, you go, oh, this is so fun. I love your home. And it's 30 years old, 40 years old, but it looks modern.
Right. Tim's calling me.